Hey, what's up guys, my name is Cherno, welcome back to my game engine series. So first of all, no, I have not forgotten about this series. I know there's been plenty of other content going on this channel, and the reason for that is I'm just in a bit of a video making mood. I'm trying new things. I am just really enjoying making all sorts of different videos. So nothing is going away. There's just probably going to be a lot more videos on this channel going forward, at least as long as this mood of mine continues. Anyway, what are we going to do today? So last time we basically wrapped up the basics, or the first kind of vertical slice of our viewport situation and our scene viewport. So check out that video if you haven't already, because that's going to lead into what we're going to be doing today. Now, I mentioned at the end of last video, because usually what I do is before I make this video, I watch the last one and see if I mentioned what we'd be working on. And I said that I didn't know what we'd be working on, which is a little bit unfortunate because now I really don't know what to do. So what we're going to do today, I've decided, is we're basically going to take a look at this whole ImGui event situation, because we could just kind of shove that under the rug and pretend that it's not a thing for a while and then later come back to it. But that's, I don't like that way of developing software. I think that if you have a problem, you should fix it and then go forward. There's something really satisfying about having an application or a game that you've made that might be minimal in features, but those features are rock solid. You know what I'm saying? Instead of having essentially something that might look like Hazel Dev, but like half the stuff just doesn't work or causes a crash, or it just doesn't work very well. So it's nice to work on something and try and get it like as high quality as possible. And that's what I'm going to do here today. Even though a lot of people might be excited for new features, I think this is probably a better thing to do going forward. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to switch over to their screen and we're going to take a look at fork. So there was a petition for me to use a dark theme, so I'm just going to do that. Done. See how much I care about you guys. So, I mean, I don't particularly mind using the dark theme for fork because it's fork. I don't use it that much. Visual Studio, obviously, I do prefer the dark theme, but I'm not a light theme hater. There were a bunch of people back at my old job that used light themes, and guess what? I talked to those people and I had friendly conversations with them. So I don't hate light theme. So if there are any light theme people out there, drop a comment below. I mean, at your own risk, because I know that you'll get attacked, but not from me. I'll give you a love heart thing if that's the case. The reason I opened fork is because I wanted to take a look at some of the things that have been done to Hazel. So this was what we did last week, and then there are some diffs that got merged in. I have been really bad in general at actually looking at GitHub and seeing what has happened and responding to pull requests and all that stuff. And I'm sorry for that. I know I should be a little bit more into this version of Hazel. It's just that obviously if I'm developing Hazel Dev, I'm more involved in that. And this is kind of like I sit down in front of the camera and I start working on Hazel for you guys as like the game engine series, and that's what that is. So because of that, I've been a little bit hesitant to do things off camera as much, and I figured that I just start this episode by looking at not all the pull requests, because I know that people will get really sick of that very quickly, but maybe I'll have a pull request episode once a month or something like that where I look at specifically pull requests, but at least we can look at the actual stuff that has been merged into Hazel, into the repository. So first of all, there was fixed wrong session name for shutdown profile session. So apparently I named the shutdown thing startup, which was silly. So obviously that's a good change. Most of these just fixing my mistakes, which is great. There was apparently a missing case here. So in other words, this is inside the shader where we actually have the kind of switch statement with all of the different branches here based on what texture you're using, and just, texture index 4 was just not implemented for some reason. So that's been added. I must have missed that because I didn't add that specific code, but we did look at it last time. Adding a virtual destructor on frame buffer. Yeah, so I must have missed that somehow. And I've still got the old code. So if we look at frame buffer. Yeah, see, that's an amateur mistake. So I put a whole bunch of code inside OpenGL frame buffer into the destructor of OpenGL frame buffer, which is very important, such as deleting the frame buffer, deleting the textures, doing all of that stuff. But since the superclass or the base class, which is frame buffer, does not have a virtual destructor, if we treat that frame buffer object as a frame buffer, even though technically you can't really have a frame buffer instance because it's a it's a pure virtual class, or in other words, it's an abstract class, so you can't really instantiate a frame buffer. It has to be one of the derived classes, such as OpenGL frame buffer. So if you create a frame buffer that is an OpenGL frame buffer, which is your only choice at this point, but then you use it as a frame buffer and you delete the frame buffer object as if it's a frame buffer pointer, which is what the shared pointer or the ref would actually do, then that destructor is not going to run, because it's going to look at this, it's going to see that, oh, it's got a default destructor, that's it, that's all you'll call, right? And the fact that the child class is virtual doesn't mean anything. So in other words, when we actually created the frame buffer inside editor layer, which was here, obviously we're treating it as a frame buffer, not as an OpenGL frame buffer. And that means that when this frame buffer gets destroyed, it goes out of scope. When editor layer gets popped off, that OpenGL frame buffer would never get deleted. In this scenario, not the biggest deal, because usually if the editor layer gets destroyed, it's because the application has been closed, so we don't care about cleaning up memory necessarily if the application closes, because it's going to get reclaimed by the operating system. In fact, it's a lot faster in a lot of cases to just not worry about even deleting memory on application close. But obviously going forward, very big mistake, and the way you fix that is just by adding like a virtual frame buffer destructor like this. You can like set it equal to default. It doesn't matter as long as it's like being overridden, or you can implement it like that, whatever. So obviously we're not going to add that code in because someone else has done it. So let's take a look at this. There's an input destructor. I want to revisit the input class at some point because I hate the way that I've done it. I'm not sure why I did it that way. There should just not be like an instance. I used to do this thing where I basically used like kind of singletons. And the reason I use singletons specifically is just because for me at the time, that was just a clean way of making sure that I can have a class that is static and there's only a single instance of it, but I can still address the members and have actual member functions or methods inside that class, which again is not something that I do anymore because I just think it's quite silly. I just don't like it at all. So what I do instead usually is I make the class fully static, and then inside the CPP file, I just have basically a static struct or something like that, which has all of the kind of member data. So that's, I think, what we did for the 2D renderer, where, yeah, so we had, as you can see here, we have, this is like every function here is static. We have no singletons, we have no members, no member functions or methods here. And we have no actual data here, but if you go to the CPP file, we have this struct called render2d data, and then we have a static instance of that inside this translation unit, which is render2d.cpp, and then that's kind of the data that we address. So it's effectively a singleton, but it's a lot cleaner, and it's none of the garbage that came with having this and having like an implementation for this. It's also really worth noting that in this specific use case of abstraction, I'll say, I know that sounds fancy. What I mean is like, you know, when we're dealing with input, right, the reason we have input set up this way is because we want a derived version of that for each platform. So we want a Windows input, we want a Mac input, you know, Linux input, we might want a special input for like Android or iOS or anything else, because input devices and input platforms change, right? And specifically, I'm talking about platforms here. It's not the biggest deal in the world because I think we're still going through GLFW here. But again, if we were on Android and we wanted touch and we wanted some other things, input becomes a very complex topic. However, it's worth noting that with the example of, because we do this abstraction in many places. We do it for the input, we do it for the window, and we also do it for, what else do we do it for? We also do it for, well, all of the rendering code. So if we look at like a vertex buffer, if I just open buffer, .h, you know, we have kind of all of our kind of render API agnostic or independent like buffer code here, like index buffer and vertex buffer. And then we have an implementation of that that's like OpenGL buffer. Now, these look the same between how we treat our rendering API stuff and how we actually treat like input stuff and Windows stuff. But in reality, they're very different, and I don't think I want to treat them this way going forward. The reason is that with a renderer API, you don't know what render API is going to be used until you actually launch the application. It's not a compile time decision, right? So I'm on Windows. Technically speaking, when Hazel supports more than just OpenGL, I could pick between DirectX, OpenGL, or Vulkan. That's totally fine, right? I could just pick any of those. And in fact, maybe picking none of them as well, having like a kind of like a headless situation here, would also be ideal maybe for testing other parts of the engine that doesn't require, rendering anything to the screen. That way you could run it on like a Linux server and you wouldn't really care about it. There'd be no window. There'd be nothing. There'd be no context to render to. And because of that, I think I even accounted for that, because if you look at some of this code, we have inside buffer.cpp, for example, we have render API none. So that's why render API none exists. But anyway, the point is you could choose any API, and that is clearly a runtime decision. The reason that's the case is because, it's nice to be able to, but also, like, we've decided that we want to be able to basically say that, like, hey, on startup, make a decision as to what API you want to use, right? And in that case, you could just, based on certain factors, you might be like, I'll use DirectX, or I'll use whatever, and it'll be based on a configuration file. Whereas if the binary literally does not have the code for Vulkan compiled inside it, the Hazel binary, I mean, then there's nothing you can do. You literally need a different binary file to be able to run Hazel with Vulkan or something like that, which is clearly not what we want. We want all the APIs compiled in there if they've kind of been, if they're available on that platform. So for Windows, it would be DirectX, Vulkan, and OpenGL. And if that's available, you can then make that decision at runtime. Now, window and input is not like that. If we have Windows input.h and then presumably in the future macOS input or Linux input or Android input or whatever, there's no runtime decision here. If you're on Android, you can't be like, yeah, I want to use Windows input. No, that doesn't exist, right? And so because of that, that clearly should be a compile time decision. Because of that, it's totally okay, in my opinion, to just make an input class that has a bunch of static functions like it does here, and then the implementation for those static functions are inside files such as Windows input.cpp. Then in that case, you have the specific functions to link to, and those files only get compiled on the respective platform. That's a much better way of doing something like this, instead of having this ridiculous mess of get mouse X and then that directs to get mouse X impl, which is a virtual function, and going through all that. I don't know exactly why I did it this way back in the day. Maybe this was just like a new piece of code that I like to experiment with, because that's another thing you should know about me. I'm not afraid of just putting in some experimental code or stuff that I have never done before because I just thought of it on the spot or whatever into this, because for me, this is all an evolution of, software. This is me working on Hazel. This is not like a Udemy course of like, this is how to write a game engine from start to finish. We're never going to go back on our word. No, this is us writing something together as we go. Right? I have Hazel Dev, and that's partially written, but it's not, it's not a complete engine that I'm then just copying and showing you guys how to do that step by step. In my opinion, that would be boring, because there'd be no discussion. There'd be no, let's try this and then maybe we'll go to this. No, it would just be very one-dimensional. And also, I decided to take you guys on this journey with me, rather than spending a year or so writing a fairly complete game engine and then making videos on it, which would just, I don't know, it would put me a year out of my life doing nothing, basically. Nothing of value, I mean, because I'd have to invest a year of my time and then go back and do this. Anyway, long story short, I'll stop rambling. What this episode has turned into is a bit of a maintenance episode. So we're going to fix some of these things. So I want to fix the input class. Event class, yep, that's fair enough. Frame buffer, having a virtual destructor. Graphics context having a virtual destructor, and renderer API having a virtual destructor. I also really want to start implementing another renderer API soon. We are probably, I think I said that I want to do Metal for macOS soon, and I guess I still want to, because macOS is a platform I do want to support. But ultimately, we will probably end up doing either DirectX or Vulkan. I have a feeling it will be Vulkan, because then at least we could run it on Linux as well. And I know that a lot of people like Linux, even though the majority of people use Mac compared to Linux. If you look at like Steam statistics or something like that, it's like 5 or 9% of people use Mac OS, and like 1 or 2% of people use Linux, and then the rest is Windows. So there's still like the overwhelming majority of people who use not Windows use Mac OS, which is why it is a high priority for me to support that, even though you guys are probably all developers and you would probably be using Linux instead of Mac if you were going down the Unix route. But that doesn't matter, because, sorry guys, it's about the actual it's about the players. It's about what the people who are going to be using Hazel not to necessarily develop in, but to actually create games in. And, you know, sorry, I realize that means the same thing. It's for the people who are going to be playing games. What do they want Hazel? Like, what platform are they going to be using, like playing a Hazel game on? And the answer is going to be Mac, even though at this stage, obviously, it's still very much an in-development engine. You guys would be surprised at how quickly it can go from an engine that is seemingly in development and completely not capable of making a game to, in a week, for example, being like, okay, now we can make a game. Because this stuff can change very quickly. Anyway, so that's that commit. And then finally, we have just a follow-up of this. Lovely Santa's just making sure that this change goes into Hazelnut as well. Because Hazelnut, and this was in Sandbox, I think, the missing texture branch. All right, so we'll update to that. So if I just check out master, we should go to that. Now I have local changes here, and I have a feeling that they're rubbish, so I'll just discard them. And then we'll just check out master. I could have just done pull as well, or fetch and then pull, whatever. Okay, and we should be on the latest commit. Sometimes this is, a lot of the times I end up actually checking out the particular commit, but if you do that, it kind of disconnects you from head, and that's not the best thing to do either. Okay, so now we're on the latest code. Okay, so first step is I'm going to refactor this input class to not be like this. Now, Hazel Dev, I already did this for Hazel Dev, and I'm not exactly sure even how, but if we look at Windows window.cpp, this is the actual implementation of this. Again, as I mentioned, this is not something, oh, sorry, Windows window. I meant Windows input. This is not something that is going to, you're not gonna want to have both Windows input and Linux input compiled in the same binary, ever. Because one is compiled on Windows, and for Windows, one is compiled on Linux for Linux. So what that means is that we can come in and clean up some of this code. So Windows input.h is deleted. And also input.h, there is an input.cpp file, which basically just, again, does all of this stuff, which is completely garbage. Let's delete input.cpp. So we've kind of cleaned that up now, right? There's not going to be a constructor. There's not going to be a destructor. There's not going to be any of this stuff. Everything's going to be static, and I'm just going to take this and massively clean it up. So get mouse position, get mouse X and Y. Oops, not const. I don't know why. Sometimes I automatically write const like that, just a habit. So none of this create stuff, none of this protected stuff. You guys can see how much this class has like become so much more basic because of the fact that we just don't need anything else. Now, okay, we have get mouse position, mouse button press. So this is like the mouse button stuff. This is like the keyboard stuff. It's very sparse at the moment, but that's okay. And if we go to Windows input, so Windows input is automatically changing. I'm just going to using the, you guys can't see that, but I'm just renaming or doing a find replace of Windows input to input. We're going to include Hazel, is it inside core? Hazel core input.h. And this whole impulse situation as well, I'm going to replace with nothing at all. And then, yeah, so this just kind of, this get mouse X, get mouse Y situation just ends up returning this, which is fine, I guess. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of it, you know, that's really all you need. And you can see that, you know, we have the static kind of declarations of the functions here. And then since this Windows input.cpp file gets compiled on Windows, the linker is going to link those declarations to these definitions. And that's what we're going to get. And that's it. No indirection, nothing. We just have normal functions. Everything should still compile and run. And obviously that massively cleans up our code. So let's be nice and let's commit that. I mean, I guess I should test it first, but I mean, it's not really worthy of being tested. Pretty simple. I mean, everything's worthy of being tested. Sorry if I'm teaching you bad software engineering practices. All right, so we're just going to commit. We're going to stage this stuff, and we're going to immediately say refactored input situation. And I'm just going to commit and push that immediately. Done. Okay, that's how dedicated I am to just making those changes. Okay, so coming out of this, I guess we're going to do a more or less code review here of Hazel, because that's what this episode has become. Drinking some orange juice because that's the kind of mood that I'm in. I think that we might even continue on this code review to the next episode because we are kind of running out of time. But what I do want to do, and I still need to do a Patreon live stream like right after that, where I'm going to continue working on Hazel Dev, and it's already getting late. So let's what was I going to do? Yeah. So what I want to do now is fix this ImGui kind of input situation. So you guys know that at the moment, I can move the camera using WASD, but that also kind of like if I'm in a text box and I'm editing stuff, that also moves the camera. I also am unable to scroll because ImGui is blocking events. I want to take a look at that situation. Now, full disclaimer, I have no idea what's going on at all. This is going to be me debugging this live. So this might take a while, because I don't even know where to start at this point. So first of all, I know that we have an ImGui layer, and that must be kind of blocking events. And the way that it blocks events at the moment is basically it says handled for the event. So since ImGui layer is the topmost event that receives input, and the way that you can look at that or see that is by going to application and seeing that we have an overlay here called ImGui, and then the ImGui layer. And then what happens is in the run code, when we do our layer stack on update, or specifically I'm interested in, the events is what I'm interested in. So if we look at events, which is on event, you can see what happens is we do an rbegin, which is like a reverse iterator. So we start from the end of the layer stack, and then we go kind of, I guess, backwards. And if the event is handled, we break. So we don't pass it down to like events further down. If we did not do this, right? If we just did that, for example, then obviously like that is specifically what's stopping the events from happening. If I scroll my mouse now, everything works, right? So step one is to understand what's actually going on. It's very important to be able to wrap your head around why exactly something is not happening. If you don't fully understand the problem, it's very difficult to fix it. Just some dust on my screen. So now that we understand the problem, let's talk about how we fix it. So first of all, when do we want ImGui to actually have access to this stuff? Like when do we want ImGui to be able to block events? Now, the only time I can really think of, and this is important because we need to think about the future here. We can't just think about how Hazel works now, because then we'll have to come up with a different solution when we change it. But ultimately speaking, at the moment, we have WASD moving this camera. That's probably not how you want this to work at all, because this is more or less something that you probably want in your runtime. We're in an editor. Maybe if you hold the right mouse button or the left mouse button and then use WASD, it would then start capturing that input, sending it to the viewport to move the camera. But ultimately speaking, you probably want to use the mouse and maybe with the Alt key or something like that to click and drag this. And WASD is just like, that's something that you use inside the actual game. And that behavior is probably going to be scripted inside the game. Now, if you have a camera like Unreal or even Unity, I think, where if you hold right mouse button, then you can kind of use the WASD keys to get more of like a first-person camera and first-person camera controller rather than like a, I don't know, like a Maya or Blender style camera, like a 3D program style camera with the you know, mouse to orbit and do all that stuff. Then that's a different story, obviously. But ultimately speaking, my point is, if I've clicked on this settings panel, and I'm clearly in the settings panel, WASD shouldn't even do anything. But the theory is that it's never going to do anything anyway, because just pressing WASD should probably not move your camera inside your editor. You need some kind of extra input to make that happen. So because of that, that's probably not a problem that is worth specifically fixing. Now, what we do need to think about though is with this on event thing, so does ImGui want to capture the mouse and does it want to capture the keyboard? Now this code, which again, as I mentioned, I didn't add myself, what that means is that we've basically, we have an ImGui window focused and navigation is enabled. So that's okay, that's for the keyboard, and then the mouse. Okay, unclick mouse. ImGui window. Yeah, okay. So That's a problem, because if the unclicked mouse is hovering over an ImGui window, or a widget is active, or the mouse was clicked, etc., then it's not gonna do that. Now this works fine for if we had floating windows like we did in the past. So in other words, back in the day when we just had like floating little windows like this, and the viewport wasn't actually an ImGui window, but it was just like actually inside our application, that is the way that we want to handle it. Because obviously if we're floating over this, we don't want to dispatch events. We have to like specifically be, well, in this case, we have to be in this window, but ultimately we don't want to dispatch events unless we're specifically not in any ImGui windows. But now the problem is that our game is an ImGui window. And so because of that, we need a little bit more control. So realistically, what we should probably do is if we go to, I wonder if the first thing that comes to mind is perhaps excluding the viewport window from like the whole event situation. So in other words, if the currently active or focused window is the viewport, keep the events going, because there's no ImGui event that we necessarily need for viewport that we don't want to send into the game, right? So I don't know if there's a way to kind of get the currently focused window or something like that in ImGui. I've honestly never done that before. Hazel Dev has a completely different solution. I'm just trying to come up with something original here, because I don't think the one in Hazel Dev is the best. But so is window focused? So we can see if the current window is focused. Focus. There's also hover. But I'm wondering if there's a way to actually get the currently focused window, or because like obviously we could just, you know, is item focused? No, that's not what I want. The thing is, like, you know, we could obviously maintain this state on our own, and that's what we'll probably do, but I was just curious to see if we can do that, but I guess it's probably better to do that on our own anyway. So is window focused? Okay, what are the focus flags? Let's see if they're anything useful. So let's find the enum. Of course, Visual Studio. Please don't unselect what I selected. Okay, here we go. So any child windows, root window, any window, root and child windows. I don't know, we'll try no flags and we'll see if that does what we want. But basically is window focused. Let's do a little hz core warn. And then we'll do focused. So this is how I like to just check that obviously the data that I'm getting is actually correct. And then the other one I'm interested in is actually hovered. So basically if we begin a window and then we ask it, it's all kind of contextual. So if we ask it, is the window focused? Is the window hovered? Then this should hopefully basically give us exactly what we need, which is if this is true for the specific viewport window, keep sending the events. Like, don't worry, because obviously the ImGui thing that we're over, or that we're, you know, that is active is you know, now focused is true, hovered is false. Well, I think when I had this, hovered doesn't work if the application is not focused, which I guess makes sense. If we focus it, hovered is obviously true if that's the case, and then focused if we do that. Okay, well, there you go. So I guess what we probably want, if you want the WASD key to work, then you probably want viewport to be focused. And if viewport is focused, then send the events through. The other thing is, with hovered, I think you could probably safely ignore hovered. The reason is that, again, if you're inside here, like, viewport isn't focused, but if you drag your mouse over to viewport, suddenly, as you can see, viewport is now hovered, but you still don't want to send the input in because that would be wrong. So long story short, we basically, when we render the viewport, we need to set some kind of flag here that says that, hey, you know, if the window is focused, then don't block events, please. Like, I need to get events because the viewport is focused. Now, how we want to solve that specifically is a bit of a different story to just solving it. I'm not sure What we could do realistically is we could probably disable the blocking of events if that's focused, and then re-enable it if it's lost focus or something like that. I'm just thinking if that's the best way to do it. Because we have an ImGui layer, we could probably retrieve that from the layer stack if we really wanted to. And then we could just set it directly on the ImGui layer. Because it is a specific layer that's blocking events. It's not necessarily an ingrained engine system. So I guess what we'll do, we'll probably do that, right? So, and it's specifically, but we want to use that, this is something that's important to do for a number of things. So in other words, you know, if we've got something else out of focus, like if this window is focused, then make sure you also don't, or rather if it's not focused, make sure that you don't do things like camera controller update, because clearly it shouldn't be necessarily update. Well, camera controller checks to see this input state stuff. So if we just don't update the camera, you know, then it's not going to, yeah, it's not going to do any of that stuff, and it should be completely fine for us to do that. So viewport focused. So this will be a boolean. Bool viewport focused equals false. We'll start it off at false. We can say that if the viewport is focused, we'll update the camera controller. We'll still do all of the rendering stuff, obviously. If it's not focused, we don't care about whether or not it's focused for that. And finally, so now let's test that out. That should stop that part. So if we WASD, and then if we go here, you can see WASD no longer works. We actually have to have the viewport in focus, which is cool. And then the next part is, does application have some kind of way of actually retrieving an overlay or a, no, it doesn't, no, it's complete rubbish. We should probably rework this entire layer stack situation, because again, I feel like I have some different ideas. The layer stack itself does have an iterator and a reverse iterator and a layer. I'm wondering if we should just have an let's do that. Let's have a ImGui layer get ImGui layer function. And do we want it to be const? Probably not. The reason is that we've already got a pointer to it. Why look through the layer stack? And I don't want to spend more of today's time adding a system to that. So to do is a complete engine review and also rewriting the layer stack. If you guys want to see that, let me know. And I'll probably do it a bit sooner than I would otherwise. But it is still going to eventually happen. So now what we should be able to do is inside ImGui layer, we should have a little bool here called block ImGui events. So events that ImGui receives, do we block them or not? So we'll have this as, I guess, true, or maybe just block events. True, and then what we'll do is void set block events, bool block events equals block, just block events. And then basically what we'll do is if block events, we'll make sure that we block these. And that's it, I think, right? Because otherwise we're not going to do anything. So if I've done that correctly, I'm not even going to bother checking it. If the viewport is focused, right? So we'll do if viewport focused, then we can do application get ImGui layer block events viewport focused. And I just realized that we have to do that kind of regardless. So basically we'll get the application and we'll tell the ImGui layer to block events based on if the viewport is focused or not. So in other words, if the viewport is focused, then we don't want to block events. So obviously block events should be the other way around. So if the viewport is not focused, then block events from reaching the viewport. Because if we don't do that, then, well, if we don't do that, the events are always going to get through. So we'll check this out and see exactly how it works. But basically, if the viewport is focused like it is now, we should be able to scroll the wheel because that's really the only event I think we have at the moment. But if I focus over here, I can't, like I can still scroll. So maybe scrolling in events should be only active if the viewport is both focused and hovered, because you probably want to, I don't know if this, like, yeah, so that's scrolling. This is what I mean. You can see that this does both, right? So realistically, we actually want to do viewport focused and viewport hovered equals. I'm making another one for this just to kind of make it, just in case we want to use it for other things. So now, so block events. So we want it to block events if the viewport is not focused and not hovered. Is that right? I don't know. I guess so. No. What are we trying to do here? I hate this stuff. So, see, this is another sign that I've probably written this in not the clearest way, because right now I'm having to really think about this to figure out what I want. So this is a boolean that obviously will block events. So if block events is on, then it's going to set handle to something else, right? So we want it to block events if the viewport is not focused. So if it's lost focus, or if you're hovering over something else. So in other words, if it's not hovered, if it's either out of focus or not hovered, right? So in other words, if we're out of focus, but we don't want it to be and, because if we've lost focus but we're hovering over it, that's still not acceptable. We want to both be, maybe it should be allow events or something like that, because yeah, that's kind of all over the place. But now if we kind of click on it to focus, and if we go off here, so now you can see I'm hovering over this, it doesn't get it anymore. And I also lose, okay, so we focus, and then if I go over here, you can see that I've still got the viewport focused, but the scroll wheel here is working and not here. So I need to kind of have that going on. And then if we dock this and click back on viewport, I should be able to move it, do all my event stuff. But then as soon as I go off here, the scrolling is going to stop, which is what you expect. The key is going to continue because that's still focused. But then when I click here, both of them are gone. Whew, okay, that is the situation. So that's going to be it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you did, please don't forget to hit the like button and help support this series and everything I do by going to patreon.com/thecherno. Huge thank you to everyone who does help support this. As I mentioned, I am going to do the Hazel Dev live stream. So if you're interested in catching me working for like hours on the kind of 3D version of Hazel, then definitely help support that, and you will get access to something like $5 a month for the live stream access. So next time, what are we going to work on? I think honestly, I would probably prefer to do some kind of engine review and fix up the rest of everything else here. The layer stack can wait because it's not like the most it's not the most it's not the I feel like saying this in Russian, but I can't say it in Russian. I'm saying it in English. It's not the most burning like thing at the moment. Like it's not like we don't really need to do that yet. So I think if all is said and done, we'll probably either do the code review next time or just get on with, I guess, developing the 2D workflow and doing all of that stuff. So let me know if you guys want me to work on something specific in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.